Cannon Mills ran 17 plants within 25 miles of a single town in North Carolina. 24,000 workers. 300,000 towels a day. For most of the 20th century, 9 in 10 American homes had a Cannon product folded somewhere inside. The standard, the default, thick cotton that lasted 20 years in the linen closet without asking anything of you. The company built the town that built the towels, and it did it without borrowing a single long-term dollar in 50 years of growth. Today, the factory is rubble. The ground was dynamited and cleared. Between those two sentences is one generation and one man. A leveraged buyout that used the company's own pristine balance sheet as collateral. A pension fund of $102 million, extracted, rerouted into junk bond annuities and wiped out when the insurer collapsed. $1 billion in acquisition debt loaded onto a company that had never owed a long-term cent. On July 30th, 2003, 4,340 workers lost their jobs before noon, the largest permanent layoff in North Carolina history. No severance, no health insurance, effective immediately. The man who set that sequence in motion later bought the rubble back for $6 million and built a longevity research campus on the ground where the factory stood. He wanted to live to 125. He made it to 102. This is the story of a 13-year-old boy who walked away from school in a defeated South and decided to close the gap between what the Piedmont grew and what it was allowed to keep, and of what one decade of decisions did to the 80 years of work that followed. Not through a single disaster, through a sequence of choices, each made by someone who had their reasons. Chapter 1. The Boy Who Taught the Boss. The story begins in the wreckage of a defeated South, in a country where the old economy had been burned to the ground, and nobody was quite certain what was supposed to grow back in its place. The year is 1865. The place is Mecklenburg County, North Carolina. Red clay farms, churches half empty, families trying to piece back together whatever the war hadn't taken. In the middle of all of that, a 13-year-old boy named James William Cannon walked away from school and went looking for work. He found it in Charlotte, room, board, and $4 a month as a clerk in a general store. He was good at it immediately, good at reading what people needed, at tracking where money flowed, at understanding the gap between what a thing cost and what it was worth. By 16, he'd moved to Concord and clerked at a store partly owned by his brother David. By 19, he'd bought an interest. By 20, he was running the operation. What Cannon did, those years behind the counter, was pay attention. He watched Piedmont farmers load their wagons with raw cotton, some of the finest cotton soil in the world, right beneath their feet, and sell it north at whatever price the northern buyers offered. Then he watched those same farmers turn around and buy back bolts of cloth, sheets, curtains, finished goods at the price northerners wanted to charge. The South grew the raw material that clothed the continent. Northern mills processed it. Northern merchants sold it back. The profit crossed the Mason-Dixon line and never came home. He called it what it was, a quasi-colony. The word was uncomfortable. It was also accurate. And James William Cannon was a merchant who had spent his adult life watching someone else collect the margin that he intended to collect himself. In 1887, at 35 years old, he borrowed $75,000 from northern banks. The irony was not lost on him. Enlisted technical help from a Philadelphia manufacturing firm called McGill and Wood, and organized the Cannon Manufacturing Company in Concord. The first yarn rolled off 4,000 spindles on April 1st, 1888. His first president was John Milton Odell, Concord's most prominent manufacturer, a Confederate veteran who ran the largest plaid mill in the South. Cannon's brother David and a banker named G.M. Lohr co-founded the Concord National Bank the same year to keep the financing local. From the beginning, Cannon thought in systems. Raw cotton in, finished cloth out, profit stays in North Carolina. Close the loop that the colony had left open for 2 decades. The first product was Cannon cloth. Coarse, inexpensive, cut for housewives who still sewed their own. It sold. But by the mid-1890s, Cannon was watching home sewing decline. Factories were producing ready-made goods. Women who'd always sewn their own curtains were buying them instead. And if finished goods were the future, you had to decide which finished goods to make. In 1898, Cannon's mill produced the first towel ever finished in the South. It sounds modest. It was not. The towel market for working and middle-class Americans was a hole in the marketplace that nobody in the region had thought to fill. Everyone needed them. Nobody down here was making them cheaply. Cannon stepped into that gap, and the gap turned out to be the size of a fortune. There's a story a former employee told years later that gets at something essential about Cannon in these early years. The man had started at the Concord plant at the age of 11, which tells you something about the era right there, before you've heard another word. He remembered that Cannon, then already a wealthy industrialist, would come to the mill and seek him out specifically, a grown man, owner of the operation, asking a small boy to show him how to run the machinery. He remembered teaching James William Cannon how to put up ends on the spinning frames. He remembered Cannon pulling on blue overalls and working beside him while they cleaned the equipment together. A wealthy man in blue overalls, learning from a child who'd been sent to work at 11. The image holds 2 truths at once. The era forced both of them to be there. Neither one cancels out the other. Chapter 2. What you could see from the train window. By 1905, James William Cannon had a problem that only sustained success produces. He was running out of room. The Concord operation couldn't absorb what demand required. He needed land, open land, cheap land, and a place to build something larger than anything he'd yet attempted. He found it 7 miles north from the window of a northbound train. Local tradition holds that Cannon was riding out of Concord when he looked out at the farmland rolling past and turned to a companion. "I'm going to build a mill town there," he said. Whether that precise exchange happened, the story has the shape of truth about the man. He was a merchant. He had spent 40 years looking at things and seeing what they could become before they became it. What he saw from that window wasn't a field. It was a factory. He dispatched a former Register of Deeds named John Kettner Patterson to assemble the land quietly, parcel by parcel, so that no single seller could figure out what the whole enterprise was worth and price accordingly. Patterson worked for months. When he was finished, he had secured 1,008 acres, straddling Cabarrus and Rowan counties, former cotton plantation ground, at an average of $23.13 per acre. Some of the most historically productive farmland in the Piedmont, bought at distressed land prices because no one else had thought to want it yet. Construction started in 1907. The first 54-room houses went up before the first mill. You needed somewhere to put the workers before the work began. An 1906 newspaper called the settlement Cannon City. In a letter to county commissioners in 1907, it received its official name, Kannapolis. The conventional claim that the name means City of Looms in Greek turns out to be a false etymology, invented sometime after the fact. Local historian Norris Dearman searched the records and found no evidence anyone called it that at the time. Nobody quite knows why the C became a K. What everybody knew was whose city it was. By January 1909, the single Kannapolis plant employed 840 workers. The empire kept growing. New mills, new land, new towns absorbing into the orbit. When J.W. Cannon died on December 19, 1921, the company had spread to 12 mills, 15,000 employees, and $40 million in annual sales. 300,000 towels rolled out of those plants every single day, every day, without interruption, in every season. The New South movement, that post-Reconstruction drive to industrialize, to compete, to stop exporting raw value and start keeping it, had found its clearest expression here in the Piedmont. The geography was purpose-built for it. Fast-flowing water for power, abundant displaced farm labor willing to work for less than New England wages, proximity to the cotton fields, expanding rail lines threading through every county. Wages ran 30 to 50% lower than the North. Child labor laws were loose. The work week stretched to 55, 60, 66 hours. These were not incidental features of the New South economy. They were the margin on which the whole calculation rested. Cannon's genius was seeing the manufacturing opportunity before the engineers did. He was a merchant who understood production, not an engineer who learned commerce. He used northern capital to close the southern loop, and in doing so built the most successful textile operation the region had ever seen. The colony had learned to make its own cloth. It had a lot more to learn. The man who would do the teaching was 29 years old, had dropped out of Davidson College, and had just inherited a company he'd been working inside since he was 19. His name was Charles Albert Cannon. Everybody called him Mr. Charlie. He would run what his father built for the next 50 years, and when he was done, the company would be something his father couldn't have imagined. Chapter 3. Mr. Charlie makes a name. Worth more than the cotton. Charles Cannon was a different kind of industrialist than his father. Where J.W. had been a merchant who recognized a manufacturing opportunity, Charles was a manufacturer who understood branding the way most industrialists of his generation simply didn't. He saw something his competitors couldn't, that a towel wasn't only a towel. It was a name on a label. And the name, if you managed it correctly, could be worth more than everything inside the factory. In 1928, he consolidated 9 separate textile companies into one entity, Cannon Mills Company, streamlined under a single balance sheet, a single management structure, a single brand. That same year, he launched what textile historians identify as the first large-scale national advertising campaign ever mounted for a fabric product. Cannon towels in magazine spreads, Cannon sheets in newspaper pages, the kind of advertising that invited American housewives to understand that what sat folded in their linen closets said something about the home they were keeping. His competitors at Fieldcrest reserved their brand name for premium lines, the good stuff, the expensive stuff. Cannon put its name on everything. Cheap towels, expensive towels, every price point in between. The name was the guarantee. If it said Cannon, it was Cannon quality. That consistency, applied across decades, built a consumer trust that no single advertising campaign could have bought. Then came the colors. American towels, for as long as anyone could remember, were white. White was clean. White was what towels were. Charles Cannon looked at that convention and then he ended it. Pastels first, then matching ensembles. The bath towel and the hand towel, and the washcloth in the same dye lot, the same pattern, the same trim. Then coordinated bath collections wrapped in clear plastic packaging so you could see exactly what you were buying before you reached for your wallet. The American bathroom became a room with a color scheme, and the Cannon name was the reason. He also returned from a trip to colonial Williamsburg, so struck by the architectural vision that he began reconstructing Kannapolis's downtown in neo-Georgian facades. a church at one end of the vista, the mill at the other, neoclassical storefronts in between. A company town deliberately designed to look like a colonial capital. The workers called it Mr. Charlie's Town. Nobody disputed the title. The Depression years tested the whole enterprise and proved what the balance sheet could actually bear. While other manufacturers were contracting, defaulting, and closing, Cannon was absorbing, plant by plant, season by season. Charles Cannon held the company together through fiscal discipline so rigid it bordered on the puritanical. No long-term debt, cash reserves maintained, no overreach under any circumstances. A company run like this could survive a depression. It could survive almost anything. It survived more than economics. In 1942, Cannon supplied the military with blankets, sheets, and bandages and produced one of the more improbable artifacts of the war effort, a jacquard woven to hell with Hitler towel, 42 inches by 22, with USA and God We Trust, and the Cannon emblem woven into the pattern. They are collector's items now when you can find them. In July 1944, a Liberty ship, the SS James W. Cannon, was christened by Charles's wife, Ruth. He stocked the ship's library himself. 8 months later, his eldest son, Second Lieutenant Charles A. Cannon, Jr., disappeared over the Burma-China frontier in a B-25D, known as a bit of lace. March 10, 1945. The plane vanished. No wreckage was found. His body was never recovered. The father established a hospital in Banner Elk in his son's name. He established a scholarship fund for the children of Cannon employees. And he kept working, because there was nothing else to do when the thing you'd built was the only permanence you had left. In 1955, in the same year the Salk polio vaccine received its first public license, Charles Cannon personally financed 100,000 doses for his workers and their families. He didn't wait for distribution networks, didn't wait for government programs, didn't wait to see how the market would allocate a medicine that had just become available for the first time. He bought it himself and vaccinated an entire community. A single man making a single decision that protected tens of thousands of people from a disease that had crippled a generation. That was the scale at which Charles Cannon operated. That was who was running Cannon Mills. Chapter 4. The Hiss of the Slasher. To understand what was lost in July of 2003, you have to understand what the inside of Plant 1 actually felt like during the years when everything was working. Not the numbers, though the numbers are coming, and they're staggering. The texture, the weight and sound and smell of the thing. The first thing the morning shift felt walking through those gates was the sound. The weaving room ran at 70 to 100 decibels, equivalent to standing beside a running chainsaw, sustained for 8 hours at a stretch, every day, year after year. Workers learned to communicate by reading lips. They became expert lip readers out of necessity, because speech was simply not possible on that floor. Studies would eventually find that close to half of all workers with prolonged weaving room exposure developed significant permanent hearing loss. Inside the plant, the sound was so constant, so total, so unvarying, that veterans stopped registering it as noise. It became the ambient condition. It became weather. You worked inside it the way you worked inside heat. Underneath the sound came the cotton. Fine white particles hung in the air continuously, drifting through shafts of light near the windows, settling on shoulders and in hair and in the creases of every sleeve. Workers left their shifts dusted white, the fibers visible on their clothes and their skin. The community outside had a name for them, lintheads, and it was not a term of affection. You knew who worked the looms from 50 feet away. They wore the work on their bodies. The workflow moved through a chain of departments, each feeding the next. each with its own particular noise and smell and physical demand. It began in the opening room, the dirtiest station in the building, where raw cotton bales were torn apart by machine into loose fiber. The opening room had been assigned by the explicit design of the era to black men. The racial architecture of the plant was not incidental. It was deliberate, enforced, and total. From the opening room, the cotton went to the pickers, machines that cleaned and loosened the fibers further, and then to the carding machines, which combed the cotton through thousands of fine metal teeth into a continuous rope called a sliver. The carding room smelled of machine oil and warm fiber, a dry, almost sweet smell that coated the back of the throat and never entirely washed out. From carding, the slivers moved through drawing and roving to the spinning frames, almost universally female-operated. Spindle speeds reached 20,000 revolutions per minute. The judgment required was precise and continuous, and the supervisors of the era held that women were better suited for it than men. Though whether that belief was accurate or simply convenient for the wage schedule, it's hard to say with certainty. What it produced was a clear division. Women ran spinning, men ran the heavier machinery. The arrangement was not examined. It was simply how the floor was organized. The yarn coming off the spinning frames went next to the slasher, a long machine that passed the yarn through a bath of hot starch to strengthen and protect it for weaving. The slasher hissed. That was the specific word workers consistently used in interview after interview collected decades later. It hissed. Wet heat and starch and that particular low sound under everything else. From the slasher to the looms, hundreds of them in the weaving room. Machines roughly the size of golf carts, banging and slamming at a rhythm that transferred directly through the floor into the soles of your feet. Stand in there long enough, and you stop feeling the vibration as separate from your own heartbeat. From the looms, the finished fabric moved to bleaching, dyeing, printing, and finally packaging. And what had been a raw cotton bale at the start of that chain was a folded, labeled, boxed cannon towel at the end of it. At its peak, Plant 1 was described as the size of the Pentagon, 6 million square feet. You could walk a straight line for 20 minutes inside its walls and still be inside the plant. The complex ran its own rail spur, its own fire department, its own water system. It was a small city nested inside the larger city it had called into existence. Cynthia Haynes, whose family worked cannon for 3 generations, remembered that her grandfather had nearly lost both his job and his company-owned house simply for letting his brother sleep under his roof during the 1934 general textile strike. Her uncle had been a union organizer. The association alone was enough to put everything at risk. Her grandfather's job, his home, his standing in the community, all of it held on the condition of loyalty to the company. That condition was understood by everyone. It was not stated in contracts. It didn't need to be. The floor was not a democracy. It was not designed to be one. The racial dimensions of the plant tell a harder version of the same story. Before the Civil Rights Act, black workers were confined almost entirely to the opening room and to janitorial work. The dirtiest labor, the lowest wages, invisible in the company's public image. Black women were excluded from millwork altogether. In 1960 nationally, only 3.3% of textile workers were black. The legal landscape changed after 1964. The plant's actual practices moved more slowly, under more direct compulsion. A class-action racial discrimination suit, Donald R. Hicks and others against Cannon Mills, filed in 1970, settled in 1982, after more than a decade in the courts. By 1978, roughly 1/4 of the mill workforce was black. The integration of the floor happened, but it happened late, and it happened because workers fought for it. In February of 2026, Kannapolis City Council dedicated a bridge to a woman named Corrine Lytle Cannon, 106 years old, described as the first black woman ever employed in production at Cannon Mills. She spoke at the ceremony. "We are all born for a purpose," she said. "I have no idea why I am still here. Most of my associates are long gone. I have been traveling on this road for a long time, a woman of 106, standing at a bridge dedication in the town whose story she had lived from the inside for more than 3/4 of a century." Chapter 5. The Town at the End of the Whistle. The mill and the town were not two things that happened to exist near each other. They were one thing with two names. Kannapolis was, for most of the 20th century, the largest unincorporated community in the United States. No mayor, no town council, no city taxes, no legal charter. Not until 1984. Cannon Mills paid for the police, the fire department, water and sewerage, trash collection, street maintenance. The company built and owned approximately 1,600 houses, rented at $5 a room per month, and painted every one of them on a 5-year schedule. The company handled all repairs, supplied utilities below market rate, and employed anyone who lived there. If you rented a Cannon house and lost your Cannon job, you lost the house too. The architecture of the arrangement was visible, and everyone understood it. It was not hidden. It was the deal. The town's YMCA was dedicated in 1925 to J.W. Cannon's memory, the largest in the South when it opened, and by some accounts the largest membership YMCA in the world. Swimming pools, bowling alleys, a 900-seat auditorium, a library. The Gem Theater opened in 1936, a full Art Deco picture palace, described by people who saw it as the finest movie house between Washington and Atlanta. The company scheduled showtimes around the mill shifts so workers on each rotation could get to the evening program. Roy Rogers attended premieres there. Today, the Gem still operates, still running films, one of the oldest continuously running single-screen theaters in America, added to the National Register of Historic Places in 2019. In 1917, Cannon arranged life insurance for all employees, reportedly the first company in America to offer this to its entire workforce. The company financed a hospital, later expanded to 300 beds. It donated land for James William Cannon High School. It sponsored baseball teams, social clubs, dances. The mill whistle marked time for the whole community, 3 shifts around the clock, and between them the whistle calling workers back or releasing them. People set their watches by it. Families organized their sleeping and waking around it. In a town with no clock tower, the factory told you what time it was. Families worked the mill across 3 and 4 generations. If your grandfather ran the slasher, your father worked the looms, and you expected to clock in right behind him. That expectation, steady, unexamined, passed from parent to child like a trade, was one of the most important things the mill provided, and one of the hardest to put a number on. By the time Charles Cannon died on April 2nd, 1971, the scale of what he'd built was genuinely difficult to hold in mind all at once. 24,000 employees, more than any other employer in either Carolina. 17 plants, nearly all within 25 miles of Concord. $305 million in annual sales, more than 50% of the nation's towel market, more than 20% of the sheet market. Consumer surveys found that 90% of American households had used a Cannon product. Walk into any American bathroom in 1971, and the towel hanging on the rack had almost certainly come through Kannapolis. The company that was providing the towels that dried America had been built, start to finish, in a 50-year arc from farmland to dominance. The balance sheet was as remarkable as the production numbers. $250 million in equity. Not $1 of long-term debt, not one, after 50 years of sustained growth. $60 million in cash and marketable securities sitting on hand. Charles Cannon had run this company on a single fiscal principle for 5 decades. You don't borrow what you can earn, and you don't spend what you haven't made. What he was leaving behind was, by any reasonable financial measure, impregnable. That was the word people used looking back. Impregnable. What they missed, what everyone inside those walls missed, was that the very qualities making the company impregnable also made it irresistible to a certain kind of buyer. Zero debt meant zero existing claims on the assets. $60 million in cash meant $60 million available to help finance its own acquisition. Fully funded pension, vast real estate holdings, strong cash flow. These were not merely signs of strength. They were, to someone who understood leveraged buyouts, raw material. The tools with which a raider could borrow against a company to purchase it, then use its own assets to pay off the debt. Charles Cannon had also spent 50 years resisting the incorporation of Kannapolis, resisting any democratic governance that might dilute his family's control of the community. When he died, the town had no independent civic institutions to fall back on, no mayor, no council, no structures that existed independently of the mill's goodwill. And when the family counted its voting stock, it totaled roughly 40%. Not enough to stop a determined buyer. The plants kept running after April 1971. The shifts kept turning. The looms kept banging. The slasher kept hissing. Donald S. Holt, the first non-Cannon to lead the company, took over and modernized management. He fought off a union drive in 1974, won 56-44. New executives came and went. Families kept clocking in. The community kept calling it home. But the summit was April 1971. That was the high water mark. The numbers that followed it would, for a while, still impress. Production continued. Profits continued. The name on the label still meant something in every American linen closet. Nobody inside those gates could see what was coming, or rather, nobody was looking in the direction it came from. Chapter 6. The water rising. Slowly. The forces that would eventually destroy Cannon Mills were not sudden. They didn't arrive in a single season with a single cause, under a single name. They gathered the way floodwater gathers, slowly enough that you keep telling yourself the ground will absorb it, until the morning you wake up and the water is at the doorframe. The American textile industry had been protected since the early 1970s by a system called the multi-fiber arrangement, a web of international agreements that let the United States and other developed nations impose import quotas on fabric goods from lower-wage countries. The arrangement was not free trade. It was a managed compromise, a recognition that if the quotas came down all at once, American textile manufacturing would not survive the competition. It held more or less for 2 decades. Then, in 1994, the Agreement on Textiles and Clothing set the MFA on a 10-year phase-out schedule. The quotas would be lifted in stages. The final stage, 62% of all remaining liberalizations, would hit on January 1st, 2005. That date was visible on the calendar for a decade before it arrived. The question was what anyone was going to do about it. At the same moment the quota walls were coming down, Walmart and Target were becoming the dominant force in American retail, and retailers at that scale had a simple and unyielding negotiating position. The price goes down every year, or we find someone who can meet the price. A former Pillowtex CEO would later tell journalists that Walmart had specifically encouraged the company to shift production overseas if that's what it took to remain competitive. Pillowtex refused. Their competitors didn't. which meant Pillowtex was paying American wages to make American sheets that cost more than the sheets next to them on the shelf. That gap was not sustainable indefinitely. Everybody in the industry understood that. The disagreement was about how long indefinitely would turn out to be. Between 1994 and 2002, the American textile sector shed 700,000 jobs. In North Carolina specifically, 100,000 textile workers lost their jobs between 1997 and 2002 alone. Not at the end of a production run, but in the middle of years that had once seemed stable. Plants that had operated for decades were announcing closure dates. The community around Kannapolis was watching what was happening elsewhere in the industry and telling itself, as communities do, as workers do, as people do, that somehow it would be different here. But the external pressures, real as they were, did not kill Cannon Mills. They created the conditions in which a company carrying massive debt could not survive. What put the debt there was something else entirely. What put the debt there was a man named David Murdoch. Chapter 7. The Man Who Came to Buy a Town. David Howard Murdoch was born in Kansas City, Missouri, on April 10, 1923. His mother died of cancer when he was 17. He dropped out of school in the 9th grade, told by teachers who should have known better that he wasn't worth the effort. When the Army tested him during the World War II, 1,500 men in the intake group, Murdoch scored highest. His teachers had been wrong. He filed that information away. After the war, he was homeless and broke in Detroit. A stranger at a diner counter helped him get a $1,200 loan to buy a failing diner. He sold it 18 months later for a $700 profit. He moved to Phoenix. He built housing. He built commercial real estate. In 1964, he went bankrupt, losing nearly $100 million. He rebuilt, this time in Los Angeles, tile manufacturing, real estate, a holding company called Pacific Holdings Corporation. By 1982, he was a major Republican fundraiser and a personal friend of Ronald Reagan, with an estimated net worth approaching $1 billion. He was 59 years old, and he had never worked a day in textiles. In the summer of 1982, Murdoch offered $44 per share for Cannon Mills stock that had been trading at $28.92. It was a massive premium, almost 50% above market. William Cannon, Charles's son, was among the first family members to sell. Within 34 days, Murdoch controlled 98% of the company. Total cost, $413 million. It was a textbook leveraged buyout. The purchase was financed largely with debt secured against Cannon's own pristine assets. The $60 million in cash, the fully funded pension, the 1,600 houses, the hundreds of acres of real estate. The company that Charles Cannon had built without ever borrowing a long-term dollar was acquired using itself as collateral. Retired Cannon foreman Foy Icard, 42 years on the floor, heard the news and put it plainly. Murdoch wasn't a textile man, and he up and bought the whole darn town. Murdoch announced a $200 million capital improvement program. He held meetings with workers. He talked about investment and growth. He had plans, he said. What followed was 3 years of systematic extraction. He slashed 3,000 jobs between 1982 and 1986. He closed 3 plants. He cut wages, in some cases by 30%, by bringing in industrial engineers carrying stopwatches to evaluate workflows and then adjusting pay rates based on whatever the Times study said was achievable. He replaced the local foremen, the boss men who had run the floor for decades, men who knew their workers by name, who knew their families, with outside managers who knew the efficiency charts. Workers who were let go were given 1 hour to clear their belongings. They came to call it Black Friday, though there was more than one such Friday over those years. The pension fund held $102.8 million. It was fully funded. Workers had contributed to it across entire careers, and the company had matched those contributions. It represented for men like Foy Icard and women like Latrell Smith, a 45-year labeler whose pension came to $57.36 a month, the one financial guarantee the mill had made that would outlast the work itself. Murdoch extracted $36.6 million from that fund directly. He pocketed it. He then used the remaining $66.2 million to purchase annuities from a Los Angeles insurance company called Executive Life, which he used to technically fulfill the pension obligations at arm's length. Executive Life, it would later emerge, had invested more than 60% of its assets in junk bonds versus an industry average of 6%. Many of those bonds had been sold by Michael Milken of Drexel Burnham Lambert. In April 1991, California regulators seized Executive Life. It was the largest insurance company failure in American history. Approximately 13,000 retired Cannon workers saw their pensions cut by 30% overnight. C.W. McKinney had worked at Cannon for 43 years. A machine had permanently shattered his leg on the floor. His monthly pension was $36.81. After the Executive Life collapse, it became about $25. Foy Icard, 42 years as a foreman, the man who'd watched Murdoch buy the whole darn town, received $104.80 per month. It became about $71. Murdoch invested the $36.6 million he had extracted in the stocks of other takeover candidates. The investment returned a $60 million profit. The union, the Amalgamated Clothing and Textile Workers, sued in federal court, alleging that Murdoch had used the pension money to finance his own deals, including his 1985 takeover of Castle & Cooke, the parent company of Dole Foods. The case settled for $1 million. S. Bruce Rayner, the union's Southern director, summarized the outcome in 9 words. He used the pension fund as if it was another source of money. Henderson Gant had worked at Cannon for 48 years. When it was over, when the fund had collapsed and the annuities had failed and the checks had been cut, he told anyone who would listen, "It was my money. I worked for it." He ripped the people off. In January of 1986, Murdoch sold the bath and bedding operations to a company called Fieldcrest Mills for somewhere between $250 and $321 million. He retained the real estate, 660 acres of prime Kannapolis property, worth approximately $100 million. He also sold the 1,600 company-owned houses to workers, the houses the families had rented for decades, the houses that came with the job, and then demolished the YMCA that J.W. Cannon had built and that Charles Cannon had kept. The pools and the auditorium and the library and the bowling alleys, gone. In August 1991, after the Executive Life collapse made national headlines, Murdoch wrote personal checks totaling $800,000 to retirees. His attorney subsequently confirmed that Murdoch did not expect the money to be permanently out of his pocket. The North Carolina Insurance Guarantee Association had already announced it would reimburse him. He had bought a company for $413 million, extracted what he needed, sold the operating business, kept the land, and walked away. In Murdoch's own accounting of events, he had improved the operation, invested where needed, and managed his assets responsibly. The 13,000 retirees watching their monthly checks shrink toward poverty had a different accounting. Chapter 8. $1 billion of someone else's debt. Fieldcrest Mills of Eden, North Carolina, absorbed the Cannon bath and bedding operations and renamed the combined entity Fieldcrest Cannon Incorporated. On paper, the combined company was a legitimate industry leader, number 1 in towels, number 1 in blankets, 3rd in sheets. CEO James Fitzgibbons invested in technology, shuttleless looms, modern spinning equipment. and the industrial logic of the merger was sound enough that you could see, if you squinted, a path forward. But the Kannapolis workforce had been cut to roughly 6,000. Rotating 12-hour shifts had replaced the old standard hours. Wages ran about $2 an hour below comparable unionized plants. And the union organizing drive that followed was fought on the company's side with an intensity that the National Labor Relations Board would later characterize in its official findings as a scorched earth, take no prisoners approach. PR firms, anti-union T-shirts distributed to workers, church-building funds receiving contributions, anti-union rallies held on church lawns. CEO Fitzgibbons filmed threat videos. 13 employees were illegally terminated for union activity. The NLRB voided the 1991 election. By 1996, despite $1.09 billion in sales, profits had collapsed to $1.1 million. Not $1.1 billion, $1.1 million, on more than $1 billion in revenue. The company was not healthy. It was bleeding through 100 small wounds. And on September 11, 1997, a company called Pillowtex Corporation of Dallas announced it was buying all of Fieldcrest Cannon. Chuck Hansen had been with Pillowtex since 1965, had taken over after the founder's death in 1992, and had built the company into a respectable mid-sized player in the home textiles market. He had a theory about consolidation, that the industry was heading toward a small number of very large manufacturers, and that you had to grow or be acquired. Acquiring Fieldcrest Cannon would make Pillowtex the biggest home textiles company in America. He was right about the logic of consolidation. He was wrong about the price. The deal totaled more than $700 million, $410 million for the equity, plus assumption of $315 million in Fieldcrest's existing debt. Pillowtex paid a 55% premium over the 90-day average stock price. Hansen projected $30 million in annual cost savings from the combined operation. Against a debt load approaching $1 billion, $30 million a year would take a long time to matter. The math started failing quickly. By the end of 1999, Pillowtex's long-term debt had crossed $1 billion. The stock, which had been at $46 per share, crashed to $11. China had joined the World Trade Organization in December 2001, and with quota restrictions eroding, American imports of Chinese cotton goods began a surge that would, within 2 years, see China's share of the American textile market jump from 20% to 28% in a single year. The company that had refused to move production overseas was now being systematically undercut by the companies that had. In November 2000, Pillowtex filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy. Chuck Hansen had told Home Textiles Today on July 31st of that year, "No way in hell are we filing for bankruptcy. That's sure as hell not on my agenda." He resigned the following day. His exit package, $4.85 million. His 2.6 million shares worth $137 million at the stock's peak had become nearly worthless at 8 cents apiece. What followed was 3 years of failing attempts to save something that had already been structurally destroyed. Tony Williams, a British accountant with no prior CEO experience and no textile background, guided the company through its first bankruptcy. He proposed a plan called Project Sunshine, shifting low-end production overseas while keeping brand manufacturing in the United States. It was a credible plan. It was killed by a coalition of board members, union opposition, and Bank of America's refusal to fund the $28 million required to execute it. Board chairman Ralph LaRover, a retired J.C. Penney executive, told Williams at a board meeting, "We don't want you. The banks don't want you." Williams received $1.5 million in severance. David Perdue was brought in as turnaround CEO In mid-2002, he arrived with a reputation as an operator, a man who could stabilize a distressed situation. Within months of taking over, he discovered $40 to $50 million in pension liabilities that had been missed entirely during the bankruptcy proceedings. A hole in the balance sheet nobody had disclosed and nobody had caught. After roughly 7 months on the job, Perdue quit. He told associates he felt he'd been misled about the depth of the problems. An internal auditor described his frequent absences from headquarters as terrible for morale. We felt he'd given up. He collected somewhere between $1.7 and $3 million in compensation before leaving to become CEO of Dollar General. He would later run for the United States Senate from Georgia. The final CEO was a man named Mike Ganaway, a former Sara Lee marketing executive whose most prominent prior achievement had been directing the American rollout of the Wonder Bra. He was, by his own admission, not a textile man. His job was not to run Pillowtex. His job was to find a buyer for what remained of it. He spent most of 2003 looking for one. Springs Industries came close. Negotiations ran through the spring of 2003, then collapsed in May, partly because of industry conditions, partly because UNIT, the Textile Workers Union, raised serious concerns about job losses. A British fabric company called Broom and Wellington held discussions and walked away. Board chairman Joshua Rowe, looking back, offered a diagnosis so plain it was almost brutal. Everything dragged on for too long. The $1 billion of debt that Pillowtex was carrying was not the result of one bad decision. It was the accumulated weight of 3 transactions: the Fieldcrest Cannon acquisition, financed with debt; the Leshner acquisition in 1998 for an additional $75 million; and the operational losses of a company caught between wages it couldn't lower and prices it couldn't raise. Every year, the company shipped fewer units. Every quarter, the losses mounted. By the early summer of 2003, plants were being idled to conserve cash. The July 4th bonuses were withheld. In the accounting department, a clerk named Linda Bryant ran out of work to do. She read several books at her desk, including all 1,024 pages of Gone with the Wind. On June 30th, Pillowtex missed a loan payment. Lenders granted extensions, then more extensions. Everyone was waiting to see if a buyer would materialize. One didn't. On Friday, July 18th, the Vice President of Human Resources, Don Mallow, called a federal labor official in Atlanta. A colleague named Helen Parker sent an email that evening. Barring an unforeseen and unexpected miracle, she wrote, Pillowtex will declare Chapter 11 bankruptcy within the next 2 weeks. A complete liquidation is planned. On Sunday, July 20th, Mike Ganaway was sitting on his back porch in Winston-Salem, reading the New York Times after breakfast. For the first time, the weight of what was about to happen landed on him as something real rather than something theoretical. It went from being an intellectual exercise to becoming a reality, he said afterward. It was one of those moments where you go, "Holy Christ, this is a big deal." He wrote a to-do list: contact social services, write a letter to the employees. On Monday, July 21st, in an hour-long conference call, Ganaway and the board accepted the liquidator's offer. The date was set: Wednesday, July 30th, 2003. Chapter 9, 8:30. On a Wednesday morning, Ganaway rose at 4 in the morning. He was supposed to sleep until 5:30. He couldn't. He drove to Kannapolis in the dark, rehearsing what he was going to say, thinking about how horrible the day would be. By the time he reached headquarters, there were already workers filing in for the morning shift. A police cruiser sat out front. Guards were stationed at the executive office doors. Workers milling in the lobby could see it and didn't know what it meant. Some asked questions. The guards didn't answer. Ganaway went to the basement auditorium, About 75 employees gathered. He stood near the front without his jacket, without his tie. He spoke for roughly 30 minutes. He stood close to them, not behind a podium, not behind distance. He said, "The worst-case scenario is upon us." His voice cracked once, talking about the Pillow-Tex family. He paused to find himself again. He said there was no bogeyman, no single person you could point to and hold responsible. He asked that everybody be treated with dignity and respect. He confirmed in the question and answer period what everyone already suspected. There was no severance. The liquidators would sell everything. The Cannon name itself would go to the highest bidder. Afterward, nobody hugged. A few people thanked Ganaway for his efforts. His audience shuffled out in silence. Across Kannapolis, across 16 plants in the United States and Canada, supervisors were reading prepared letters over the phone. Workers were being called at their desks, at their stations, in parking lots as they arrived for shifts. The calls were brief and specific. The plant was closing, effective immediately. Your employment was terminated as of today. 7,650 workers affected in total. 6,450 terminated on the spot. 1,200 kept on temporarily to manage the wind down. In Kannapolis and the surrounding counties, Cabarrus and Rowan, 4,340 workers lost their jobs on a single Wednesday in July, the largest permanent mass layoff in North Carolina history. The record has not been broken. Janet Patterson was 56 years old. She had worked at plant number 6 in Concord since 1965, 38 years hemming sheets. She had custody of 5 grandchildren. When the call came, she told the reporters who found her, "There ain't no Pillow-Tex. I ain't got no insurance. My pension's gone. Everything's gone." Ruth Crisco, 10 years at the mill, a union team leader, said, "Workers have lost everything. Their livelihood, their homes, their cars. Bank of America's getting everything back." City Council member Darrell Hinnant walked through town that day. People were in shock, he said. They had tears dripping off of their chins. Some were collapsing on the sidewalk. They had no clue what they were going to do. Health insurance ended that morning, effective immediately. Back wages for the final weeks of work, not paid. Severance, none. Accrued vacation, not honored. A rapid community survey conducted in the weeks after found that 43% of former workers were already behind on rent or mortgage. More than 10% had received eviction or foreclosure notices. 93% said they couldn't afford health insurance at market rates. 42% had a family member who also worked at Pillow-Tex. When the mill fell, it fell on entire families at once. One of those workers was Laurie Seyfried. She had worked at Cannon since 1995. 3 months before the closure, her husband had died of stage 4 kidney cancer. He left her with 3 children, ages 4, 8, and 12. She got her termination call during the cascade of earlier layoffs in June, before the final closure date. She would eventually go back to school. She teaches welding at Rowan Cabarrus Community College today. Chapter 10. The sound, the ground forgot. The profile of 4,340 workers standing outside those gates with nothing tells its own story through numbers alone. Average age, 46. Average tenure, 17 years. 40 to 50% without a high school diploma. 59% women. Roughly 500 non-English speakers, most of them Hispanic. Average weekly wages had been $458. Unemployment benefits averaged $275. A gap of $183 a week, every week, for as long as the unemployment lasted. 70% said they were unwilling or unable to relocate. Governor Mike Easley formed a state rapid response team and visited Kannapolis personally on August 4th. Senator John Edwards spoke about the textile industry's collapse in his 2004 presidential campaign. The Pension Benefit Guaranty Corporation assumed responsibility for the Pillow-Tex pension plans in October of 2003. The two plans held approximately $271 million against $460 million in liabilities, a gap of nearly $200 million, affecting 23,000 workers and retirees. This was separate from the Murdoch pension raid 2 decades earlier. Different fund, different mechanism, same result. Cannon workers were not cheated once, they were cheated twice. Rowan Cabarrus Community College expanded its workforce programs, welding, electrical, HVAC, healthcare, and saw enrollment surge 40%. The college won a National Workforce Development Award in 2005. By that same year, 2,730 former Pillow-Tex employees had found new jobs. The majority were in non-manufacturing sectors. Most of them were earning less than they had at the mill, some significantly less. Virginia Dinah Russell had operated towel machinery at Cannon for 30 years. She was 63 years old when the plant closed. She couldn't find work for 2 years. She dipped into her 401k. She took early Social Security at 62. She depends on a free clinic for her diabetes and blood pressure medications. She told a journalist, "We were thinking that mill was going to be there forever. I worked in textiles all my life. That's all I knew." On December 10, 2004, David Murdoch's company, Castle and Cook, won the auction for 264 acres of the former Cannon Mill site. The winning bid, $6.4 million. The site he had acquired as part of a $413 million transaction 22 years earlier. D.H. Griffin Wrecking Company began demolishing Plant 1 in June of 2005. On March 24, 2006, the remaining towel distribution center and bleachery, together representing more than 1.2 million square feet, were imploded. David Griffin noted that the 40-year-old structures were built like a fort. He said it with a kind of professional admiration. The buildings had been designed to last. They had lasted. And now they were being brought down in a controlled sequence of explosions that lasted less than a minute. On August 10, 2006, the twin 225-foot smokestacks came down. The ones painted with the names Fieldcrest and Cannon, 2 words visible for miles in every direction. The clearest skyline landmark in the county, the thing you could see from the train heading north from Concord, the same view James William Cannon had seen 100 years before and decided to turn into a city, gone in seconds. Griffin's crew recycled what the demolition left, 600,000 tons of concrete, 106,000 tons of asphalt, 20,000 tons of scrap metal. Town Lake, the body of water at the center of the original complex, was drained and filled. The physical plant, 6 million square feet, built over a century, was erased from the map with the thoroughness of an erasure. The smokestacks going down was not a news event in most of America. It was local. A few people drove out to watch. A textile industry veteran who witnessed it wrote later about incredible sights that left me with a sense of loss for my former employer and this industry. One sentence. That was the accounting. Chapter 11. What the label says now. In September 2005, David Murdoch unveiled Project Phoenix, a plan to redevelop the former mill site as a biomedical research campus. State and federal officials attended the announcement. Senators Elizabeth Dole and Richard Burr, former Governor Jim Hunt. Murdoch personally invested more than $500 million. The North Carolina Research Campus opened across 350 acres, hosting research facilities from 8 universities: UNC Chapel Hill, NC State, Duke, UNC Charlotte, and others. The David H. Murdoch Core Laboratory opened on October 20th, 2008. It sits exactly where Town Lake used to be. Murdoch's motivation was personal. His wife, Gabrielle, had died of ovarian cancer in 1985 at 43 years old. In the decades after her death, Murdoch became consumed by the science of longevity, convinced that with the right nutritional research, the right discipline, the right investment, a man could live to 125. He ate with monastic specificity. He exercised daily into his 90s. The research campus was, among other things, his attempt to prove the point. He died on June 9th, 2025, at the age of 102. The campus enrolled 12,526 local residents in the Murdoch Study, a longitudinal health research project examining the genetic and environmental factors behind chronic disease. The study bears the name of the man whose pension rate had impoverished the community it was now asking to submit blood samples. Kannapolis city manager Mike Legg tried to hold both truths in the same sentence. That was painful to see that icon removed, but the end result was rebirth and a transformation of this community in a way that without David Murdoch we wouldn't have been able to achieve. Former cannon worker Barbara Hunter offered the other sentence. It was never intended to benefit the people who worked at the mill. Both are true. The record supports both. In October 2003, the Cannon brand name was sold at auction to a liquidation consortium for $128 million. In 2007, it was acquired by Iconics Brand Group, now Iconics International. The name is licensed globally today. The towels are manufactured overseas and sold through retailers like Wayfair. Iconics' marketing describes Cannon as one of the most recognizable and best-selling home brands in the world. The name is there. The Kannapolis address is gone. The workers who wove the fabric that made the name worth anything are collecting Social Security, and if they're lucky, reduced pension checks from an insurance fund the PBGC assumed 2 decades ago. WBTV reporter David Wisnant bought one of the last American-made Cannon towels in 2003, on the day the plant closed. 5 years later, he still had it. He'd used it every day. "It still looks new," he said. "Kind of like those workers in this town. Maybe a little faded, but still strong." The town of Kannapolis has not died. Its population has grown from 36,000 in 2000 to an estimated 63,000 today. Unemployment fell from nearly 11% in August 2003 to 3.4%. By the end of 2024, the city spent $113 million on downtown revitalization over 5 years. A $52 million minor league baseball stadium opened in 2020. The Atrium Health Ballpark, home of the Kannapolis Cannonballers, named for the mill and for Dale Earnhardt, the NASCAR driver and native son who grew up in the shadow of those smokestacks. New employers have come. Amazon, Gordon Food Service, and Eli Lilly pharmaceutical plant under construction nearby. The Gem Theater, renovated in 2023 and 2024, is still showing movies. One of the oldest continuously operating single-screen theaters in America, in the same building it's occupied since 1936. A craftsman named Brent Offenberger salvages structural beams from the demolished mill complex and carves wooden toys from them. He sells them. There's a market for them among people who understand what the wood is, where it was, what it held up for 100 years. What did the mill make at its core, underneath the towels, underneath the sheets, underneath the marketing campaigns and the market share numbers and the bankruptcy filings? It made a life that was possible in a place that had no other reason to exist. It made a town. It made a set of expectations that parents passed to children and children pass to grandchildren. You will come here, you will work, you will be paid, and at the end of it there will be something for you. The work was hard. The noise never stopped. The cotton dust got in your lungs. The supervisors held power that wasn't always used with care. The racial architecture of the early decades was a wound the community spent years recovering from. And still, it was alive. It had a structure. It had a purpose. On any morning shift from 1909 to somewhere in the 1990s, you could walk through those gates into a building the size of a small city and take your place in a chain of work that turned raw cotton into something real, something useful, something that ended up folded in a linen closet in a house somewhere in America, taken for granted the way you take for granted anything that's always been there. The mill is gone now. The smokestacks are gone. The lake is gone. The pension fund was raided and the annuities collapsed and the checks got smaller, and for some workers they stopped altogether. The brand name is owned by a licensing company in New York, stitched into fabric made overseas, sold on websites that ship within 2 days and charge $5 for returns. Go find an old cannon towel, a real one, cotton made in North Carolina, thick as a bath mat and built to last 20 years. They turn up sometimes in estate sales, in the back of linen closets that haven't been opened in a decade. Pick one up. Feel the weight of it. That weight was made by 24,000 people in a town that was built from bare farmland because a 13-year-old boy once walked away from school and decided he was going to close the gap between what the South grew and what it was allowed to keep. It took one generation to build it. It took one generation to destroy it. The morning shift started at 6. The whistle hasn't blown in 20 years. The silence that filled in where it used to be has a shape, and the shape is the shape of everything that was there.